Hey everyone, welcome back. So today we are going to take a deep dive into
This is gonna be good.
yeah, it's pretty fascinating but complicated stuff. We're going to be looking at the lasting impact of Donald Trump's policies
Okay.
on people of color.
Yeah.
And we have this great article that really digs into the consequences
Yeah.
of those policies, particularly for marginalized communities.
I think it's interesting because we're not just looking at the policies themselves, right? We're looking at how all of these policies interacted with kind of what was going on in the country at the time,
Right.
the social and political climate, and then that created these kind of ripple effects that I think we're still seeing today.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I guess the big question is, what were both the intended and the unintended consequences of these policies?
Yeah.
And to do that, we need to kind of set the stage right. Trump ran on this America First agenda,
Right.
which was all about deregulation, boosting domestic industries, renegotiating trade agreements.
Yeah.
So how did that approach actually play out in practice?
Well, I mean, the stated goal, of course, was economic growth, right? But many critics were worried about potential negative consequences,
Mhm.
particularly for communities that were reliant on social safety nets or that were facing environmental injustices.
Mhm.
And, this was all happening during a time of pretty intense political division.
Yeah.
The Black Lives Matter movement was gaining momentum and really shining a light on racial inequalities.
Right.
And those inequalities would really become much more prominent, I think, during Trump's presidency.
Yeah, it's like you can't really understand a play without knowing the setting and the backstory of the characters. Right?
Exactly.
So it seems like this America First agenda, while maybe well-intentioned,
Yeah.
may have unintentionally exacerbated some existing disparities.
Precisely. And I think you see that play out most starkly, maybe, in the area of immigration.
Okay.
One of the first things Trump did was issue that executive order,
Yeah.
the travel ban, which targeted several Muslim-majority countries.
Like Executive Order 13769.
Yeah, you can imagine the impact that had.
Oh, absolutely. This climate of fear and uncertainty,
Yeah.
especially for people of color,
Yeah.
all of a sudden you're facing all these restrictions
Right.
based on your nationality or religion.
Right.
It's not just about travel.
Right.
It's about feeling unwelcome, feeling targeted even.
Exactly. It fed into this broader narrative of exclusion that we saw across many of his policies.
Right.
And it really brings up this question, who is considered American and who is seen as an outsider?
Yeah.
And how do those perceptions then shape and influence policy decisions?
That's a big one. And it wasn't just the travel ban.
Yeah.
The family separation policy
Right.
at the border was obviously incredibly controversial.
Oh, yeah.
Thousands of families seeking asylum were separated.
Right.
Imagine the trauma, especially for children of color, being ripped away from their parents.
It was just a deeply disturbing policy that sparked so much outrage and protests across the country.
Yeah.
It really forced people to confront the human cost of these policies.
Right.
And how they disproportionately impacted communities of color.
And then there was DACA, the
Yeah.
Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program,
Right.
which protected undocumented immigrants
Yeah.
who were brought to the U.S. as children from deportation.
Yeah.
Trump repeatedly threatened to end DACA,
Mm-hmm.
leaving all these young people, many of them people of color, in this constant state of limbo.
Living with that threat constantly hanging over their heads.
Yeah.
It's such a clear example of how these policy decisions can have a real impact on people's lives, right?
Absolutely.
Creating this sense of instability and fear.
Okay, so we've seen how that narrative of exclusion played out in immigration policy,
Right.
but it seems like it also manifested itself in the economic sphere as well, would you say?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the cornerstones of Trump's economic policy was the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017.
Right.
The goal, of course, was to stimulate economic growth.
Right.
But did it benefit everyone equally?
Well, that's what I was wondering. The article suggests that while corporations and wealthy individuals saw significant benefits, the impact on marginalized communities was much less clear.
Exactly. One study found that the top 1% received 83% of the tax cut benefits,
Wow.
while the bottom 20% only received 6%.
83% versus 6%.
That's a big difference.
That's wild. It's
Yeah.
like the rising tide that lifts all yachts but leaves smaller boats stranded.
Right.
And while the overall unemployment rate under Trump did reach historic lows, including some gains for Black Americans, wages for many workers of color remain stagnant.
You're making a great point there because a lot of people might look at those low unemployment numbers and be like, oh, this is a success story.
Right.
But you really have to look deeper, right?
Right.
Having a job doesn't necessarily mean earning a living wage
Right.
or having access to those opportunities for advancement. And then, of course, you have the economic fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic.
Right.
And again, communities of color were disproportionately impacted.
Yeah.
They experienced much higher rates of job losses and economic hardship.
Yeah, it's like all those existing vulnerabilities were just magnified by the crisis.
Exactly.
It really highlights the need for policies that address systemic inequalities,
Right.
not just offer these kind of temporary fixes.
Yeah. Band-aid solutions aren't enough.
Right.
We need to be looking at the root causes and working to create a more equitable system.
So from the economy, let's shift gears a little bit to another area where we see these disparities come into play.
Okay.
Criminal justice.
Right.
Trump was very vocal about his law and order approach,
Yeah.
often endorsing these really aggressive policing tactics.
Mm-hmm.
So how did that stance resonate with communities of color?
I mean, it created a lot of tension,
Yeah.
particularly with the Black Lives Matter movement, which
Yeah.
was really calling for police reform and accountability.
Right.
You know, BLM was advocating for change,
Mm-hmm.
but Trump often framed these protests as lawlessness.
Yeah.
And he even went so far as to deploy federal agents against groups that he labeled as anarchists.
So you had these two very different narratives playing out.
Yeah.
And I imagine for a lot of people of color who were already feeling targeted or marginalized,
Right.
this just intensified that fear and mistrust toward law enforcement.
Right. Especially with, you know, high-profile cases of police brutality continuing to make headlines.
Absolutely.
You know, just think about what it's like to live in a community where you feel over-policed and underprotected,
Right.
where your concerns are dismissed or even met with hostility. It creates this deep sense of alienation and distrust.
Like this vicious cycle, right?
Exactly.
The more mistrust there is, the harder it is to bridge that divide and build positive relationships.
Exactly. And it's not just about policing either.
Right.
Trump's efforts to repeal the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare,
Right.
also raised concerns about healthcare access for people of color.
Yeah. The ACA, while not perfect, did expand healthcare coverage to millions of people.
Yeah.
Including many in marginalized communities.
Yeah.
So rolling back those protections, particularly for pre-existing conditions, had the potential to disproportionately impact those who are already facing barriers to healthcare.
Absolutely. And then there was that public charge rule,
Right.
which basically made immigrants fearful of using public benefits like healthcare or food assistance because they were worried it would jeopardize their chances of getting a green card or becoming a citizen.
It's a tough spot to be in,
Yeah.
having to choose between your health and your immigration status.
Exactly. It was a very controversial policy.
Yeah.
Critics argued that it created this chilling effect that discouraged immigrants from accessing these essential services.
Okay, let's move on to education, another really crucial area.
Okay.
Trump was a big advocate for school choice,
Yeah.
pushing for charter schools and voucher programs.
Uh-huh.
But the article points out that this approach sometimes came at the expense of funding for public schools,
Right.
which often serve a higher percentage of minority students.
It's a complex debate for sure. You know, there are valid arguments on both sides.
Right.
Proponents of school choice argue that it empowers parents
Right.
to choose the best educational options for their kids,
Uh-huh.
while critics worry about diverting resources away from already underfunded public schools.
And it's the students who suffer when those schools lack resources.
Right.
And on top of that, you have the changes to Title IX,
Yeah.
which is the federal law that prohibits sex-based discrimination in education.
Uh-huh.
Some of the changes made under the Trump administration really spark concerns about weakening protections against sexual harassment and assault,
Right.
particularly for vulnerable students.
I mean, creating a safe and inclusive learning environment for all students,
Right.
regardless of their background or identity, is so important.
Absolutely.
And any policy that undermines those protections is really a step backward.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's tackle another big issue, the environment.
Okay.
Trump's administration rolled back a number of environmental regulations, arguing that it would boost the economy.
Uh-huh.
But as the article highlights, these rollbacks often had a disproportionate impact on marginalized communities.
It's important to remember that communities of color are more likely to live near industrial sites and in areas with higher levels of pollution.
Yeah.
So weakening those environmental protections can really expose them to greater health risks.
It's environmental injustice,
Yeah.
plain and simple. And then there's climate change,
Right.
which the Trump administration largely downplayed.
Uh-huh.
But we know that climate change is real,
Yeah.
and it's having a disproportionate impact on communities of color.
Right.
They're often on the front lines of those extreme weather events and rising sea levels.
It's not just an abstract concept.
Yeah.
It's a reality that's affecting people's lives right now.
Absolutely.
And we need to be addressing it with that sense of urgency and equity.
Okay, but amidst all these challenges,
Yeah.
the article also points to a more positive development, and that is the resurgence of social justice movements during Trump's
Oh,
presidency.
absolutely. That's a crucial point, I think.
Yeah.
Because in many ways, Trump's policies and rhetoric actually galvanized these movements. It gave them this renewed sense of purpose and urgency.
Right.
The Black Lives Matter movement in particular gained even more momentum,
Yeah.
especially after the murder of George Floyd in 2020.
That was a real watershed moment.
It was. It sparked those nationwide protests and forced this national conversation about racial justice and police brutality.
And it wasn't just BLM.
Right.
We saw all these grassroots organizations and coalitions mobilizing around a wide range of issues.
Exactly.
From immigration reform to economic equity to healthcare access.
It was this powerful wave of activism demanding change.
And social media played a huge role in amplifying those voices, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It allowed people to connect and share their stories and organize in ways that weren't possible before.
It's a good reminder that even in the face of adversity, people still have that power to come together and demand a better future.
Yeah, it really is inspiring to see people coming together like that, demanding change, especially when things feel so divisive, you know?
Absolutely.
But it also makes you think about the lasting impact of all of this, right? Like, where do we go from here? What are the long-term consequences of all these policies, you know, on people of color?
Well, the article definitely doesn't shy away from some of the harsh realities.
Right.
I mean, it talks about the legacy of fear and insecurity that was created,
Yeah.
especially among immigrant communities. And it really highlights how systemic discrimination, which was already deeply embedded in our society, was often exacerbated or amplified during Trump's presidency.
So it's not just about immediate impacts. We're talking about long-term consequences.
Exactly.
That could take years, maybe even generations to fully address.
Yeah, we're talking about things like, the widening economic inequalities that we see.
The strain on access to essential services like healthcare and education, and this persistent gap in opportunities that can really limit social mobility for generations to come.
It's a lot to think about, and it makes you wonder, what can we do? I mean, what can we learn from this deep dive into, Trump's America?
I think one of the biggest takeaways for me is that we need more inclusive policymaking.
Yeah.
We can't just treat the symptoms right.
Right.
We need to be looking at those root causes of inequality and really centering the voices and the lived experiences of these marginalized communities in the policymaking process.
I think it's about recognizing that these policies have real-world consequences that impact real people.
Exactly.
And that we all have a responsibility to create a society that's just and equitable for everyone.
Absolutely.
It's not just about righting past wrongs.
Right.
It's about building a better future.
And that future has to begin with understanding the past,
Yes.
learning from our mistakes, and committing to doing better.
Yeah.
It's an ongoing process, and it requires all of us to be engaged and informed and willing to challenge the status quo.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up this deep dive. I really appreciate you joining me today.
Yeah, this was great.
It was a really thought-provoking conversation.
It was.
And for all of you listening out there, we want to leave you with one final thought.
Yeah, what role will you play in creating a more just and equitable society?
It's a question worth asking.
It is.
Because ultimately the future is shaped by the choices that we make today.